I want to start with introductions to Congressman Mike Thompson. He was first elected in 1998. He represents California's 5th congressional district, which includes all of Napa and parts of Contra Costa, Lake, Sonoma, and Solano counties. Congressman is a member of the House Committee on Ways and Means and serves as the chairman of the Select Revenue Measures Subcommittee and is a senior member of the Health Subcommittee. I also want to welcome Congressman Jared Huffman. He was first elected to Congress in 2012. He represents the 2nd congressional district, which spans from the North Coast, the Golden Gate, all the way up to the Oregon border, including Sonoma County. He currently serves on the Committee on National Resource, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Welcome, Congressman. Thank you for your time. Great to have you both here.
Oscar, thank you very much. I'm going first, correct?
Yes, and I think we have, yes, so the layout for the viewers at home who are watching this in their pajamas right now is that we're going to have each of the congressmen give us a bit more detail about the CARE Act and the Family First Act so that everyone has the understanding of what these acts were intended to do. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we actually see these acts doing, and we'll move forward to maybe talk a little bit more about future solutions, other issues that are coming up as we deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. So with that said, I hand it over to Congressman Mike Thompson to give us an overview of the CARE Act.
Oscar, thank you very much. It's good to be with you. Thank you to everyone who's joining in this webinar today. I'm not but for those of you who are, you should be. I'll be very brief because I want to hear your questions and I want to hear your concerns. What I'll say is that, and I think everybody's pretty up to speed on what Congress has been doing and what Congress has done. We've passed 3 pieces of legislation focused on the fallout from this pandemic. The last and probably most publicized piece was the CARES Act that you mentioned, Oscar. And that bill was designed to do a couple things. Most important was to provide money so small businesses could retain their employees and that they would have a small business to open back up once we get to whatever our new normal is, and to be able to keep the doors open for those who are in the essential category now. But to make sure their employees had money in their pockets, so they would have employees to come back and those employees could continue to make their house payment, pay their rent, feed their family, and those types of things. It focused on the unemployment sector a lot, expanding the unemployment program for the first time ever to include sole proprietors and gig economy workers. And when I say expanded, not only in the number of people that qualify, but also put a $600 a week provision in that folks would get more money than they would ordinarily get from $600 a month. They would ordinarily get from their unemployment insurance. Now, when you said you wanted to focus on some of the things that are going right and going wrong, one of the problems is a lot of this money isn't going to where Jared and I and our colleagues intended it to go. We see more and more examples of this as the program goes on. We saw that big article yesterday where a couple of mega restaurants, Potbelly and Ruth Chris Steak, got all of this big funding, and a lot of small restaurant owners didn't get anything. I'm hearing that from a lot of folks in our district. And as you probably know, a lot of the small restaurant owners are minority owners, and it becomes very, very hard for folks to get the money that they intended to get. We're negotiating right now to add more money to this because the funds have played out. We've given out all of the 55,000 loans, and sadly, only 55,000 loans in California. We're still waiting to get the data on our particular districts, but the program's out of money, and we're negotiating with the Senate and the White House to add more money to the pot, so there'll be more money accessible to small businesses. But we want to make sure of a couple of things. We want to make sure the money goes where it is intended to go, and we want to make sure that we have money in there for healthcare, and we have money in there for state and local governments, because this pandemic is costing state and local governments a lot of money. And if they can't balance the books, that means they're going to lay people off. That's teachers, firefighters, cops, and that further damages the economy and harms small businesses. So it needs to be done, but it needs to be done correctly. And then lastly, I'll just say the money needed for healthcare is extremely important, because we have to remember that this pandemic is a healthcare crisis. And everything else, the economic side, the worker displacement, the lack of places to recreate, those are all externalities of a healthcare issue. So we've got to fix that. So we need to make sure that we have money for test equipment, we have money for the protective equipment that the healthcare workers need, and that we're doing all of the research and development necessary in order to ensure that we can get out from underneath the weight of the health problem, and then get back to work and get back to dealing with whatever our new normal is going to be. So I look forward to hearing your questions, your concerns, and your advice. And thank you all very, very much. And thank you for adhering to the direction of the experts and making sure that you're staying home, you're social distancing, and that's the way we're going to get out from underneath this. So thank you all.
Well, thank you, Congressman Thompson. I'm going to turn the mic over to Congressman Huffman and see if he could fill us in a bit more about the Family First Act, and open up the floor for your discussion as well.
Well, thanks, Oscar, and thanks to Ricardo and Herman Hernandez and the rest of your incredible team at Cien. I continue to just be enormously grateful and impressed for the bridges that you're building between Latino community residents and community leaders and elected officials. And a moment like this, really underscores the value of that. So thanks for reaching out and including me. And thanks to my colleague, Mike Thompson. You know, Sonoma County is really lucky to have a very senior member of the Ways and Means Committee as one of the two scruffy members of Congress that represent this county. Mike serves on what might be the most powerful committee in Congress. And when it comes to developing bills that are in the trillions of dollars, the Ways and Means Committee just has a tremendous influence in the shaping of that. And so we're very fortunate to have him. He's also a really good partner to work with representing this county. He even doesn't seem to resent too much that my part of the county is prettier and has the best wine. We nevertheless work very well together, and I'm honored to have him as a colleague. So look, I'm frustrated that Congress is working at home out of repurposed spare bedrooms and extra offices, and climbing all over each other on conference calls, and like everyone who's joining this webcast, kind of dealing with workarounds. This is a moment where we have huge stakes for the health of the American people and the economy of this country, and we need to quickly find a way to get Congress back on the field. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things Congress has already done and answer some technical questions about that. But I just wanted to put out there that I'm pushing hard to try to get Congress actually up to full speed so that we can do a lot more. And it's just going to be far easier to do that if we activate some of the protocols and technologies that others are finding ways to do, including Cien right now, because Congress hasn't quite gone there. We've been a little slow and ossified in modernizing the way we do our business. So Mike mentioned that there have been 3 acts of Congress so far. There was an initial $8.3 billion supplemental funding measure that went out really quickly when this pandemic became known to us. And we won't talk too much about that, but it was mainly about shoring up the healthcare institutions at the federal government, NIH, CDC, the folks who will fund research into vaccines and therapeutics, to make sure that there was no lack of resources at that level. Now, there have been all sorts of fumbles when it comes to the federal response on testing, and we're way behind where we should be, but it has not been for lack of resources, because we put that money forward very early on. Now, Mike gave you a little detail on the third action, the third part of that package, which is the CARES Act, the $2 trillion package that included those items he mentioned. I'm going to talk a little bit about the second piece of legislation, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. It gets a little bit less attention, but it's got some really important provisions that I'd like to outline for you. And unlike the CARES Act, which originated in the United States Senate, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act was a House Democratic production. It ended up being very bipartisan, but this was shaped by House Democrats, and it reflected our priority to ensure the security and the health of the American people. So it focuses on health. It focuses on some initial down payments on the economic security we knew families were going to need. And it also focuses on our food safety net. Those are really the 3 elements. So starting with the health piece, it's about testing. We wanted to make sure that coronavirus testing would be free to absolutely everyone in this country. And that includes whether or not you have health insurance. It includes whether or not you are documented. So we did that. Now, we still don't have the actual tests, and that's another matter, and it's a huge frustration, probably the biggest failure of this Trump administration in this crisis, the failure to get us where we need to be on testing. But again, it's not for lack of resources, and when those tests become available, they will be free to absolutely everyone. On the health front, we also increased support for Medicaid. We plussed up the federal match on what's called FMAP because we knew there was going to be a surge of demand with the Medicaid system. And then on economic security, we did some pretty unprecedented things. We provided mandatory 2-week paid sick leave to all Americans. Now, there's some exceptions that apply to that, but for anyone that works for a company with 500 employees or less, you would now have a mandatory 2 weeks paid sick leave, and then an additional 3 months of paid family and medical leave. That sick leave will be compensated at full salary, up to $500 a day, $511 a day. The family medical leave gets compensated at a lower amount, up to $200, but these are long overdue benefits. This is kind of beginning to bring the United States up to where the rest of the industrialized world is when it comes to paid leave. And this crisis enabled to take that very important step. Want to emphasize that independent contractors and gig workers are eligible for these benefits. And also, we took some measures to enhance the unemployment insurance benefits available in all 50 states as part of that. Finally, on food security, we wanted to strengthen our nutrition initiatives. That includes SNAP and student meals, senior meals, and food banks. With each passing week, we see the incredible strain on our food safety net. And so that was an important down payment. Obviously, we have more work to do. But I will just close by saying I think we're already starting to see some of the benefits of having passed this Families First Coronavirus Act. In fact, just this week, CalFresh here in California saw an expansion of SNAP benefits as well as WIC funds to meet specific nutrition needs for pregnant women, new moms, and young children. And these do not depend on immigration status. So this is one of the areas where the work we've been able to do does flow through to everyone in the community, regardless of their status. And then our public health centers, our community clinics, have been able to get, in recent weeks, $2.6 million just in my district. That's money that was appropriated in the CARES Act that Mike Thompson talked to you about, but it flows down through some of the programs we created in the Family First Coronavirus Act. And that includes things like supplies and testing equipment, telehealth services, and additional staffing that'll be needed to get through the crisis. So I want to just say that all of this has been a rapid response exercise. These bills have come together very quickly. We are learning, even in these first few weeks of implementation, about gaps, about additional work that we need to do. And I think Mike and I would both be happy to talk to you about some of our priorities in beginning to fill in those gaps. But I will say, in terms of the debate right now, and you're probably hearing and reading a lot about the fact that the payroll protection program has temporarily run out of money. We all want to replenish that program. But I think my Democratic colleagues and I want to make sure as we do it, we're also fixing it, and that we're also addressing the other critical needs we have right now. And that is local government, which is straining just to keep operations going because of the hit they're taking, and our hospitals, and again, the food safety net, which is really straining. So we feel like right now it's a moment to address all those things while we fix the payroll protection program, because let's be frank, maybe relying on mostly big banks to quickly push out $350 billion and assuming that it would get to the small folks who needed it the most, that might not have been the best idea. On a first come, first served basis, we have seen a lot of abuse and a lot of self-dealing, frankly, from some of these lenders. And we want to bring other lenders into the mix, community-based lenders, and make sure we find ways to get this money out to those who really need it instead of just padding the portfolios of these big banks. So I think I'll stop there. Happy to answer questions. Great to be with you.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Huffman. And you are quite perceptive there in that there's lots of questions that are coming in as we're talking here. I think what I would like to do moving forward here is go through a round robin of these questions, and they're going to be jumping around different subject matters, but I think both of you congressmen have correctly pointed out that the general public is becoming or has become well aware of these acts and the general parameters of these acts, and now there are questions that have to do with what's coming next or what can be done to fix a program that seems to be helping, but not everyone. So I'll start with Congressman Thompson on this first question. We were talking about unemployment insurance and how the CARE Act provided some assistance there. It looks like it's going to, a couple of things needs to be replenished, and a better system for distribution needs to be put in place. Along those lines, will there be any consideration for providing undocumented workers with unemployment insurance, since they most often are at the front line and critical employees?
What we did at the federal level was we expanded it, as I said, to include self-employed and gig economy workers. And we did this $600 a week enhancement on the program. I think the problems that you're experiencing are with the state EDD. And I believe Jarrett was on the same call I was on the other day when we tried to work out some of these issues. And we were told by the secretary at the state level that it was going to take some time to put these new program into place. I just received notice, I think it was yesterday, that they are set to roll this out at the end of the month. From realizing a program that's going to address these issues. So as this plays out, we'll continue to be monitoring it. And if there needs to be changes at the federal level, I will certainly, I don't want to speak for Jared, but I will. We're both on your side, and we'll hammer this. But hold tight for the next couple of weeks to see how the state program rolls out. I'm hopeful that they're quicker than their expected time.
Well, thank you for that, and we have had quite a few questions on this. So all I can say, Congressman, is that keep in mind, at least for that particular benefit, that there's a lot of undocumented workers working the fields, particularly, and other places who will need that assistance. But moving on to the next question, to Congressman Huffman, you mentioned in the Families First Act that there were several provisions for food assistance, SNAP, and so forth. Is there any concern that you see now flowing out of those programs that has to do with the food chain or the diminishing of the food supply chain and lack of actually providing what these measures are intended to do?
Yeah, I am concerned. And there's several ways in which I think we're feeling the impacts on the supply chain. Certainly in agriculture, you've got a huge amount of our food supply that is geared toward restaurants and school lunches and things like that have largely been shut off with this pandemic. And so that's why you're hearing about food wasting in the field, people dumping milk, stuff like that. And then you've also had some outbreaks of the coronavirus in meat processing plants and in places usually with Republican governors who want to pretend like pandemics don't go into Republican places. And so they've not done a very good job of being proactive, and they're really paying the price in South Dakota and Iowa. But all of us are going to pay the price potentially as you see these parts of our food supply pinched because of their problematic leadership. What we are told, what Mike and I are told by the chair of our agriculture committee and others, is there's still plenty of food in this country, but the ways in which we move it around and get it into distribution and sales channels are being heavily disrupted. And so food banks, for example, are really feeling the pinch. In some cases, they get extra food that is no longer coming to them because restaurants and others have shut off those lines of access. So it's just a huge disruption. It's one of the reasons why we want to elevate food banks and other part of the nutrition safety net into this next immediate round of emergency funding, because it's a real problem. I don't know if Mike wants to add to it.
Well, I'll just add one thing. You did a great job. You hit all the points, but there's two things that I talked about: restaurants and the Ruth Chris Potbelly people getting all the money and the mom and pops not getting any. And those restaurants that all of us frequent in Santa Rosa and Sonoma, Napa, Marin County, Humboldt County, these are all critical to our food supply, because they're a market for the people that raise the animals, grow the food, make the wine, provide the linen, everything in the chain. So if these restaurants go away, that's going to be a disruption in itself. And then, Jarrett mentioned the food banks, and I think it's deplorable that we are, the collective we are allowing food to be dumped, milk to be dumped, when food banks are short of food and people in this great country are going hungry. It seems to me that we ought to be able to figure out some sort of response to this. And I think the Department of Agriculture really needs to step up and figure out why do you dump an entire tank of milk? Why not take it someplace where people need milk and let them have it? Why do you plow under, tons of vegetables that could very easily be distributed by food banks? So we really need to get ahead of the curve on this one. And this is something that the Department of Ag should be working overtime on.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're getting a host of questions on the Small Business Administration loans and the funding for the Paycheck Protection Program. I'm going to just put the question out there and have both of you give me your takes on it. There is concerns with the program, first of all, that it wasn't funded with enough. There is a concern that a lot of the funding or some of the funding may be restricted to, say, nonprofit organizations that provide critical services. Second, that just generally that the money that is being loaned out may be too restricted for to give the business owner some flexibility in how it's used to keep their businesses afloat. Knowing these concerns about the shortage of money, maybe the lack of cover to all the businesses, and inflexibility of itself, I'll open it up to Congressman Huffman first, and we'll have Congressman Thompson chime in as well.
Well, there's no question there needs to be more money. So nobody really disputes that. The real question is, what kind of conditions and reforms do we attach to that additional funding? And just speaking for myself, I feel like a first come, first served program that was dominated by big banks who made more money if they pushed big loans was a mistake. And again, Mike Thompson and I didn't write this bill. It came out of the United States Senate, and we improved it through negotiations with Nancy Pelosi to make it much more friendly to Main Street and not Wall Street. But it still is way too stacked in favor of big institutions that have a built-in incentive to push these larger loans out where they make more money and where they shore up their own business lending portfolio. And that's just not what Congress set out to do in this program. So one of your questions was about some of the uses of this PPP loan. And I think it's important to clarify that there's several tools available to small businesses. The paycheck protection is intended mainly to be about keeping your payroll. So I don't know how much more flexibility we can build in, because that is the tool that we really have to keep targeted on employees and keeping these jobs alive. Some of that funding can be used for other purposes, and there's a formula that you can kind of, it's a little complicated, but that part is not forgivable. The payroll part that you use is totally forgivable, 100% paid by the federal government. There's additional tools though. There are emergency grants, there are disaster loans, and it may be worth people kind of looking at the full landscape of resources and not trying to fit all their needs into just the Paycheck Protection Program. I'll let Mike jump in with whatever he wants to add.
Well, thank you, Jared. And Jared covered most of it, covered all of it. You did a good job. I'll just add a little bit. I agree completely. And as Jared said, nobody is in disagreement with, save maybe a couple of knuckle draggers that we work with, that we need more money in this program. We do. There was never any dispute about that. We knew we did 3 pieces of legislation. We immediately started talking about what the 4th piece would be. Originally, we thought it would be a stimulus bill where we put more money in, investing in infrastructure and green energy and things of that nature to get the economy going again, get people working again. But we found out that the monies in COVID-3 were going so fast that we needed to replenish that. And that's where we are right now. No dispute about it needs more money. Where the dispute is how do we get this money to the people that Congress intended it to go? You know, we hear constantly these problems. My phone's ringing off the hook from constituents who aren't able to get the money they need to keep their employees online. Jared's right. We had a big problem with one particular bank in our area that was working under restraints because of their bad practices during the Great Recession. And so they said, well, we can't lend anymore because we're under these constraints. And we went to Congress. Congress went to the, they could lend more, and lo and behold, they couldn't lend more because they lended it to all their big accounts. And as Jared said, this is the sort of activity that's going on where many lending institutions were trying to improve their bottom line and improve their relationship with the big businesses. And sadly, it's at the expense of the small businesses. And that's what it is that we work so hard on, to make sure that we were able to get that money to the small businesses. There's also some holes in this one. Ag is not able to access the same programs that other small businesses are able to access. That needs to be closed. Oscar, you mentioned some nonprofits. 501c6s aren't able to participate. That needs to be fixed. Excuse me. All of that is in the new, in our effort to negotiate this new piece of legislation. And there's also money. There was almost $10 billion that went to specialty crops, and this is something that's really important to ag in our area because grapes are a specialty crop, and Department of Ag has been very slow in getting that money out the door. And the rules, that's where flexibility that you mentioned needs to be shown. And so we're working on that. But all of these things that you talk about, that's what it is that we're trying to include in this new appropriation of money. If it's just throwing more money at this problem, it's going to end up being spent the same way, where your members are going to be excluded and the people that don't need the help are going to get the money. And that's wrong. So a couple of things. Reports that the money has all been spent and the negotiations have stalled. It's true, the money has been spent, but there's more money on the way. And it's not Nancy Pelosi stalling this. She's been an absolute wonder in getting the enhancements that we're all supportive of. And she continues to negotiate on behalf of the House to make sure we have a bill that will work for the American people and the American workers whom were intended to be helped by this bill. It's Mitch McConnell who adjourned the Senate and went home without taking up the bill. But I am very confident that next week we'll see legislation passed that will appropriate more money for this program.
Wonderful, wonderful. And believe me, the general conversation that I've had with friends and colleagues and everyone that I communicate with is that when those two bills came out, everyone was very appreciative. They saw some rapid response, and they felt recovery was coming near on many fronts. But what I'm hearing in the rollout and in continued conversations is that the oversight of how that money was spent should have been a bit more tight. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you both is, as your Congress is contemplating a fourth, maybe potentially more waves of acts and fundings, will there be any consideration to put in place what was initially discussed, which is a special inspector general oversight, or someone who can see whether big banks are administering the money right, whether unemployment benefits are being made out to the people that need to go to? Is there any consideration like that? I'll start with Congressman Huffman.
I'm going to try to resist the temptation to really get on my soapbox and pull my hair out on this question, because it's a really important one, Oscar. What the president did, literally in a signing statement, to take the oversight mechanisms that we put into the CARES Act and then basically say, I'm not going to comply with them, and to then undermine them by firing the one inspector general that most of us had some confidence in to step in and play this role, is deeply disturbing. And just so you know, that oversight framework, because this was a rapid response process, we were trying to move quickly, we were trying to move in a bipartisan way. The sort of off-the-shelf oversight thing that we could find close to this scale came from the Recovery Act. I wasn't in Congress then, Mike Thompson was, but that was the last time we pushed this type of money out the door quickly and wanted to make sure it was spent properly. And there were bipartisan oversight mechanisms built into that the Obama administration did honor. And we were able to make sure that the law was complied with and there wasn't double dealing and profiteering and other things. That's all this was. And yet this president refuses to play ball. And it is maddening. It's one of the reasons I think we've got to get Congress back in session. We've got to start holding hearings on this. We've got to start holding hearings on the fact that 2 months into this crisis, we've had nothing but broken promises on testing, and all of the discussion about reopening the economy, about relaxing these shelter-in-place rules, it's all just hypothetical until you can get enough testing and PPEs in place to be ready to tamp down outbreaks, to measure the spread, to prevent new outbreaks, and to know who can safely return to work. So there's just so much that Congress needs to do to get back on the field, making sure that that $2 trillion in the CARE Act was spent legally and appropriately is a huge part of it, but it's actually more than that.
Well, I'll just add that there needs to be oversight and there needs to be transparency. We put in the bill specific oversight provisions, and the speaker is now has appointed a special select committee to oversee this and to make sure that we are able, similar to the 9/11 commission, be able to see how things work and what worked and what didn't work. And Jared's right. There was the IG provision in the bill. The president unilaterally said, hey, I don't care what Congress did. I don't care that Congress thinks there needs to be oversight and an inspector general to make sure this is done right. I'm not going to comply. And this is not something new from this president, as you know. And it's something that we're going to have to deal with for as long as he's still there. He doesn't believe the rules apply to him. And this is life and death. From the failure to use the Defense Production Act to get test kits, to get ventilators, to get personal protective equipment, to the failure to make sure this money goes to the right people. This is life and death for people. And this isn't about, some ego-driven person wanting his name on the checks that go out. We've got to get this right. The American people deserve it, and we need to do it now more than ever.
One quick question, maybe just of my own curiosity, is the president's insistence to have his name on those paychecks delaying those paychecks from going out?
Well, Oscar, as you know, because the president himself told you, He didn't insist on this. He had no desire to do it. Somebody at Treasury wanted to do it. And I got to tell you, and they also, Treasury has said that it's caused no delay. And there's not one person on this webinar who for a minute believes that you're going to reprogram an entire check program and not cause a delay. And even if it's 1 second of a delay, it's too much. And even if there's no delay, if they get these checks out ahead of schedule, it's still shameful.
Agreed. So I want to move a bit forward now because, like I said, a lot of the questions about the way these two acts have been working or not have been addressed or discussed in some part, and there is an indication that our respective congressmen here get it, and that they're going to be fighting for some of the things that were left out from these acts or supplement them further. But moving forward, as we're thinking about that, I sort of see this recovery at the next phase kind of in a two-headed threat. There's the healthcare threat about how to manage soft openings going forward and all the healthcare provisions or markers that you need to have in place. And then there's the continued economic threat about how do you get the economy going back again. I'm going to start back with Congressman Huffman on the public health side.
Yeah.
And fill us in on what Congress would be looking at as they hopefully come back into session soon.
Yeah, and as vexing and complicated as this issue seems, all of it comes down right now to two critical bottlenecks: testing and protective equipment. And it's real interesting to talk about, you know, the kind of metrics you'd want to see so you could begin to identify certain sectors, certain employees, and you can begin to reopen the economy and start with small group things and eventually move up to larger gatherings. That's all very interesting, but you can't do any of it. You can't have hospitals resume elective surgeries. You can't have the tourist economy open back up in the coast of Sonoma County and Mendocino County unless you have the ability to do in places where you've been able to contain it, to do surveillance testing and to have the stockpiles of testing to deal with any outbreaks, and then to have the stockpile of protective equipment to deal with any surge to the healthcare system. Without those two things, this is all just talk. And the challenge here is that even 2 months into this crisis, we still don't have a national plan. On testing, there's still not a single person in charge at the federal government of a national testing strategy. You've got Dr. Bricks that talks to some labs. You've got Jared Kushner that talks to private sector entities. No one is really in charge, and they still won't invoke the Defense Production Act to just grab manufacturing capacity and give us the tests we need. Same really goes for the personal protective equipment. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but it really is the answer to all of these things. We've got to get a handle on testing and protective equipment in order to get to all the other things that we all desperately want to do. And Mike and I have been frustrated at the federal level because you have this powerful authority that this administration just won't exercise. And in the absence of that, the states, the county public health officials, and individual hospitals and clinics are all fending for themselves in this wild helter-skelter competition with everyone else in the world who's also trying to get these kind of components at the same time. That's just not working.
And we're going to stay on the same topic right now on the healthcare side for future planning. Congressman Thompson, do you see any move by Congress to implement or provide mental health funding for the next package?
Was for mental health, did you say?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It's clearly an issue, and we're experiencing in every community in the country. This has taken a real toll. and Congress needs to step up and address the critical shortfall in funding. Mental health is a bigger issue. They have Sonoma County, as you know, this terrible homeless problem, and in every county in the country, we have too many people in jail. And in both instances, a big component of that is mental health. So even without pandemics, without natural disasters, our mental health programs are woefully short and they're woefully underfunded. So we need to do a lot more. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the things that the Affordable Care Act did was put mental health and physical health on equal parity. Mental health parity became a reality with the Affordable Care Act. And that's the first time it was recognized as being, that significant and important. So every effort to do away with the Affordable Care Act is in fact a statement against appropriate mental health. And we can't forget that. So you can't be for abolishing the Affordable Care Act and for mental health. It's incongruent. Okay. And you know that I do a lot of work on gun violence prevention. And one of the things that I find very troubling, or some of my colleagues will say, we don't need to do anything on guns. It's all a mental health issue. And these are the same people that are not only doing nothing on guns, but they're also working overtime to defund mental health programs and to do away with the Affordable Care Act that provides mental health parity. So yes, Congress has to do a lot more, and we're really seeing it up front and close during this pandemic and this shelter-at-home order, under these shelter-at-home orders.
Great. So what we're going to do next is, because we're continuing to have lots of questions come in, we're going to kind of go through a rapid fire. I'll shoot out a question, give you 30 seconds to answer it, and then we'll move on to the next question. So here is the first question for Congressman Huffman. Will there be, is there any concerns going forward that the sort of wages of undocumented workers in the field were going to be sacrificed to the expense of helping agriculture in general for the supply chain? Because there was some talk about dwindling down the rate of pay for them.
I don't know if that conversation is taking place at the state level, but I'm not hearing anything to that effect at the federal level. And certainly anything like that would be something that I think Mike Thompson would oppose strenuously.
Next question, Congressman Thompson, do you see a greater need to force the implementation of the Defense Production Act to ramp up things such as testing kits, masks, protective gear? Is that part of the discussion?
Yes. That's what both Jared and I both talked about that. This law has been on the books since the Korean War. And the reason it's so important is, and we all know that this administration kind of left the test kit responsibility up to the private sector. And that's not a bad thing, but private sector doesn't respond unless there's a market. And none of us on this webinar are going to go out and say, we're going to build all this stuff because maybe somebody will buy it. You've got to have pretty good assurances that people, that there is in fact a market there. What the Defense Production Act does, it creates that market. It says, General Motors, build these ventilators, we're going to buy them. And that's not what this administration did. The administration said, we'll let the private sector do this. They'll figure this out. And that set us back. And that's why we had problems getting PPEs. That's why we had problems getting ventilators. And that's in large part while we're having problems with the test kits. Make no mistake, There is not a resource issue associated with either the lack of PPEs or the lack of test equipment. Congress did its job. We appropriated the money to buy this stuff. It's a supply chain issue, and that's what's got to be fixed.
So now switching over to Congressman Huffman, on that same point, because we're getting questions on this, on the PPEs and distribution. If this is a supply or distribution issue, is there something that Congress can do to address that, aside from just funding it outright?
Well, it's challenging because Congress doesn't have the authority of the Defense Production Act, and the president does. So, you know, what we can do is continue to call for that authority to be used. We can perhaps create some directives in the legislation that we move forward to try to activate it. I'll be honest with you, I think it's going to be hard because I think this administration has really boxed itself into a corner on this. They have sort of set course with the private sector, as Mike said, and they want to be able to do it in a way that doesn't nationalize the supply chain. It doesn't work that way. Mike and I were on a call the other morning with Ron Klain, who was the Ebola czar in the Obama administration, and he, I think, did a great job explaining that in a pandemic, you can't worry about just making and buying the exact amount of stuff you need. You're never going to know how much you're going to need. You've got to go all in and maybe even produce and buy way more than you think you're going to need. That's not the end of the world. You can stockpile it and we can be ready for the next pandemic. But this administration has really taken this very tentative and deferential approach to the private sector, who will never overproduce unless they know they're going to be able to sell every unit of what they make. That's why even this far into the crisis, you still have Abbott Labs, for example, with this interesting new test that nobody can get a hold of.
Right, right. Switching gears.
On that call, Ron said something that I found interesting. He said, whenever you're buying for a natural disaster in a situation like this, there's only two ways it can end up. You can either buy too few or you can buy too many. Yeah. And, you know, with apologies to Huey Lewis, I think it's better to have and not need than need and not have.
Well said, Huey Lewis, well said. Moving to a different topic that we're getting questions on, and we touched upon it briefly, is the increasing or providing funding to local governments, schools. And one of the questions that was posed is whether there would be any funding to strengthen or further the broadband access, given that now everything is online, or for the most part.
So I'll take a first shot at that if I could. So there was a very initial step toward providing some of those resources, not nearly enough. But look, this crisis really has brought into sharp focus some of the disparities in this country and social justice gaps. And you know, part of that is the health outcomes that very disparately hit communities of color because of pre-existing health problems. But part of it is this learning gap. And, you know, when we tell everyone you're going to do distance learning for the rest of this year and maybe part of next year, it is exciting to see how that works in areas that have broadband. There's some really great innovation going on, and it's a plausible workaround. For a lot of the communities I represent, for example, the heavily Latino community in the Canal and San Rafael, or if you want to go out to the coast of Sonoma or any part of coastal Mendocino County, it just doesn't work. You don't have the kind of connectivity, and the limited resources we've made available don't even begin to come close to what will be needed. So sometime in the next few legislative responses, I think Mike and I would love to get to a big, bold infrastructure initiative. And we want to make sure that it includes broadband. This can be the crisis that finally closes that broadband gap, which is going to be a good thing, not just for distance learning, but it's going to be a good thing for telemedicine and for rural economic development and just basic needs of life in the 21st century for all of these communities who deserve better.
And Congressman Thompson, on the same topic of schools and funding and so forth, would there be any consideration or discussion in the next session or act to come about providing additional funding for these local agencies like school districts to continue their programming?
Well, look at it this way. Look at the 3 bills that we've already passed as stopping the bleeding. So the big bill, and a lot of people called it a stimulus bill, the COVID-3. It was a stop the bleeding bill, and COVID-4 is going to be stop the bleeding too. But after that, that's when we're going to focus on stimulus, things to get the economy going again, to bring jobs back, and to address some of these tremendous needs that we have. And Jarrett pointed this out with broadband. How can you do distance learning when at a certain distance you have no access to the technology that brings you the learning part of that? So broadband expansion is certainly part of it. Our investments in healthcare facilities. We know for a fact that some healthcare facilities are just inadequate, even in good times. And the healthcare facilities are what's really keeping us going right now. So we're going to have to invest in those as well. An infrastructure bill that deals with not only the traditional infrastructures and roads, bridges, and highways, but an energy our investments have to be resilient. We're going to make a big investment, and it really needs to be done in a way that will be around for generations to come. And yes, investments in school, Oscar, is every bit a part of that.
Switching gears a little bit, but also a question that has been posed by many here as we're going through is what Congress intends to do, if anything, regarding the November elections in terms of participation.
Yeah, I think every Democrat I know feels passionately that we have to include support for states to move to a mail-in ballot program for this fall. All the information suggests we're still going to be under some kind of restriction, or at least many communities, and there could be outbreaks in November. And what we don't want to see, we got a great example of what you don't want a week and a half ago in Wisconsin, where they failed to plan for this. They got up right to the brink of the election, and the governor wanted to cancel it, and the Supreme Court said you can't cancel it, which presented people with this horrible choice. Do you exercise your constitutional right to vote and put your life at risk, or do you stay home and put our democracy at risk? That just doesn't work. And I think the only way to avoid it this fall, and frankly, the only way to prevent this authoritarian president from shenanigans that you could easily imagine him trying, is to make sure every state has the ability to do a mail-only election.
Okay, and on the same general type of topic, Congressman Thompson, will there be any consideration to postpone or modify in any way the collection of the census, since a lot of the money that we're talking about for a lot of these programs may be tied to census counts?
I haven't heard any discussion about modifying or rescheduling the census. Everything that I've heard has been we need to go ahead and do it. I don't think you can do it without bringing Congress back for a vote. And I don't know that even if we came back and voted for something, I don't know that this president, who has done everything he can to disrupt the census, would sign that into law. what we need to do, unless there's something changes down the road, is do everything we possibly can to make sure people participate in the census. And right now, with people being home, it's even easier to do. So we should use all of our collective resources to get the word out and make sure people are participating.
Excellent. Just a few more questions here because we are running out of time, and we have a big list, and hopefully both of you gentlemen can join us on another occasion and give us a recap of where we are at that stage. But going forward, there were some questions about, just a second here, whether there would be any consideration in the next round of funding for supporting hospitals who are not necessarily on the front lines, but still are delivering necessary care, rural hospitals, other hospitals that are providing surgeries and so forth, because it all seems to be COVID-19 related, but these other places are not, I guess, not being allowed to function as they normally would.
Mike, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm just trying to unmute. Yeah, as I mentioned, we need to make a better investment in our hospitals, and in certain places they're way under par, and we need to recognize that. Community health centers are so critically important to us, not only during a pandemic but all the time, and we need to really do more in that regard. I think you mentioned, maybe Jarrett mentioned, the importance of broadband for things like telemedicine, and we know in the last in COVID-3 we had provisions that expanded telemedicine for Medicare personnel, and that was my legislation. That was my bill that was put into that bill, and I've been doing telemedicine for a long time. Started back in my days in the state Senate, and this is incredibly important. It can save a lot of lives, and it can save a lot of money. So we need to upscale our rural facilities to be able to provide that type of service as well.
I'll just add that I'm hearing the dire feedback from hospitals, both rural and suburban in my district. We have done some initial things to help address this. So these bills that we've talked to you about here today included something in the order of $100 billion to deal with the facilities costs of COVID-19. Hospitals have to put in special reception and screening areas. They need to repurpose certain rooms and ICU capacity. They have to make certain staffing and equipment changes, and obviously all of this protective equipment. We've provided resources for that, and we've also greatly modified the Medicare reimbursement system. So we've given them more flexibility to be compensated for telemedicine and other kind of things that frankly we should have compensated them for a long time. These will be long-term improvements to healthcare resulting from the changes we make during this crisis. And we've allowed them to increase the medical reimbursement for Medicare and to draw advances from the federal government to get through the cash flow crunch. But I think we are probably going to be approaching something like a bailout for hospitals in the weeks and months ahead. I think it's inevitable. And so we should just be honest about that. When you look at the economics of hospitals, especially rural hospitals, what they've had to do, shutting down all these elective procedures and frankly keeping a lot of their space unutilized, just hammers their bottom line, and there's no way to come back from that. So I would suggest we need to have just an honest conversation, just as we have with the airline industry and other parts of the economy. We're going to need to just push some money into our hospitals to keep the lights on.
And I think we're getting close to the end here, Congressman. So in closing, when do you expect Congress to come back into session, and when should the people here viewing this expect to see some additional movement in Congress in terms of another act for funding?
I'll let Mike have the final word on that, and I'll just say I want Congress in session 3 weeks ago. It's driving me crazy that Congress is not in session right now, and I think each passing week, each passing day, you see the price of not having Congress, having hearings, doing deliberate, transparent development of bills. We've talked about some problems in the CARES Act. Some of that is because it was hatched entirely behind closed doors without hearings and without deliberation and transparency. So for lots of reasons, and to provide our constitutional duty of a check and balance on the executive, we have got to get back on the field. They're telling us not before May 4th. I am not satisfied with that, and I'll let my senior colleague have the final word on the subject.
Well, I agree. I want to be back as well, and I don't want to speak for Jared's wife or my wife, but they really want us back also. We need to get back. We need to do our work, but it needs to be done safely. We need to follow the advice of the professionals, and we need to go back when it's safe to go back. The date that is target date is May the 4th, possibly before. I hope sooner rather than later.
Well, Congressman, I do thank you for your time. I know that there is a wealth of questions that we were not able to ask you. We were trying to do our best to ask as many sort of synthesized questions as possible. And for that same reason, I would ask that you have us in mind to come and talk to us again, because we really want to make sure that you are given a platform here to answer questions through Cien. So thank you both for your time. Thank you both for your hard work and your effort. We appreciate you having coming here and talking to us, and keep up the good fight.
Thanks so much, Oscar. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you very much. I'm all in for doing this as soon as you want to do it again. And we can take questions for as long as we have the time to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Be safe.